Now, I'm not sure if this was meant to be Chatham House rules when we were sitting at the table, but the Treasurer did let slip that he loves Q&A. He loves the question session because he gets to go off script. I think we're going to have a bit of fun with his media advisors right about now, which is cue to the audience for all the questions that will take the Treasurer off script. And I'm going to pause because this is a great opportunity for you. I do have a question. Here we go, right at the back.
Treasurer Pallas, Danny Addison from the Urban Development Institute. Lovely to hear from you as always, and the theme on jobs and growth is always welcome in a room like this. Australia has a major urban renewal site. I believe it's the biggest and best opportunity we have down at Fisherman's Bend. Barangaroo in Sydney was announced around about the same time, conceptually at least, and is now about 80% built out. In the same time, we haven't done too much at Fisherman's Bend, but rightly so, the government has been very vocal about the impact on jobs that uncertainty in planning policy could have around the parliamentary revocations. Has the impact on jobs been assessed at Fisherman's Bend in terms of the Minister's recent decision to press pause on that planning framework, and will it be impacted?
Thanks, Danny. Yes, we announced yesterday that the Planning Minister had exercised his statutory rights to call in some 26 apartment construction proposals, none of which had actually been commercialised or taken into the marketplace yet, but many of which I think are really an illustration of how bad the behaviour of the previous government was. So to go back a step, Fisherman's Bend was an example of the government deciding with the stroke of a pen against all planning advice that they'd received departmentally to rate at capital city standing all of the land in Fisherman's Bend. That meant that nothing had been carved out for amenity, for roads, for facilities. That meant that if the state wanted to acquire any of that land, it had to pay for it at the capital city rate. So we paid $10, $15 million recently to buy a playground to put a school into place. So quite frankly, the idea that the massive uplift that the landholders got out of that planning, I think was nothing short of a public outrage. And it still confounds me that this story has not been an issue that has haunted the Leader of the Opposition to this very day. But importantly, we now have the responsibility of fixing up this mess. And simply to give people the opportunity to build apartments as high as practically they want, I think is wrong, and I think it's bad policy. And importantly, what we're saying is the Planning Minister will now review each and every one of those apartments approved in order to make sure that they sit consistently within appropriate urban design. I understand that this will be a matter of concern to the holders of those apartments. I can assure them that the government is not in the business of holding them or treating them in any way that would constitute a poor reflection on the bad judgment of the previous government, but it is our intention to make sure we get a good urban design outcome here.
Have we got other questions around the room? Sorry, one here in the middle.
Treasurer, Nick Rees from the University of Melbourne. I heard the Federal Treasurer Scott Morrison on Melbourne radio yesterday, and he was saying that in his view not much is happening in the way of infrastructure development in Victoria. I'll try to channel Scott Morrison, which, as you would know, doesn't come naturally to me. But he sort of said, you know, we offered Victoria $2 billion for West Link, they didn't want it. Tried to offer them money for Melbourne Metro, they didn't want it. Tried to say Victoria should take a leaf out of the West Australian Labor government's book, where apparently they've now got the money flowing. Can you comment on Morrison's assessment that there's not much happening in the way of infrastructure development in Victoria, and also tell us, how do we get the money flowing to this state?
Oh, well, thanks, Nick. That's a great question. Firstly, can I say I heard the same interview, and what shocked me about it was I was just trying to work out in my mind what parallel universe had Scott Morrison been beamed down into, because certainly the Victoria that I see currently, we've increased the 10-year average capital spend for the state of Victoria from $4.9 billion to in excess of $10 billion a year. And we've done that in 3 years. We've doubled the capital allocation. Indeed, if you look at the projects that are going on in Victoria at the moment, I am spending almost as much capital, I say I as if I own the money, but the state of Victoria is spending almost as much on capital infrastructure in Victoria than Scott Morrison, on behalf of the federal government, is spending for the entirety of the nation. So this idea that there's not much going on, Scott Morrison ought to get on a train and listen to the people who are cranky with us because of all the level crossing removals or problems that are associated with getting on and building the new environment. Or indeed, I think often in politics, particularly today, you can say whatever you want and just keep saying it as if it's true. And I hope at some point people call that nonsense out for what it is. But how do we get going without the support and assistance of the federal government? Well, we keep doing what we've been doing. Try to work with them, and when we can, regional rail revival, for example, $1.5 billion of money they threatened to hold out as a result of the successful lease of the port, for might I say almost twice what Sydney got for their port. So we'll continue to do the things that we can as best we can when we can work with them, and when we can't, we'll just get on. I mean, I could make excuses and I can bang on for hours about the injustices of dealing with the current federal government, but quite frankly, materially that doesn't fix any of the problems that confront the fastest growing economy and the fastest growing population in the country. So we just have to get on and do it, regardless of what the Commonwealth do or don't do.
Down the front here, thanks.
Andrew Komisarov from Colin Biggers and Paisley. The first question that our international clients ask us when they arrive at our office after having arrived at the airport and battle their way through on the freeway is, when are you guys going to build a rail link? What should we tell them?
You tell them that the Treasurer has finally given up on arguing against an airport rail link. Look, I will absolutely accept that I've been running what I think is an entirely logical argument, that if we have to spend money on upgrading public transport, we should do it on the things that people use day to day and affect the capacity of people to get to work every day. The truth is, there is, every time you ask the community what's the most important piece of public infrastructure, they will come back and tell you an airport rail link. Now, it's not that I lack rigour in my determination to make sure that we get good policy outcomes, but I think there's something different going on here that perhaps I hadn't been alerted to, because I think Victorians have a massive pride in their city, and they see that an airport rail link might not be something that they use every day, but it's something about the status of the city. So we have announced, of course, that we're working with the federal government on designing an airport rail link. We've also identified that our preference would be to see that rail link go through Sunshine as part of upgrades and improved services to Geelong and Ballarat. And we expect that it will be well underway by the time that Melbourne Metro is finished. But all of these things have to be sequenced. When you think about the capital works that the state has in place at the moment, if you don't get your sequencing right, then ultimately they'll all come a cropper, and we'll pay the price for poor staging and poor delivery of our infrastructure works. But I'm prepared to take the hit as being the guy who was most sanguine, unenthusiastic about an airport rail link. But now I think we're now putting it into the staging of future delivery. I hope the federal government will partner with us on it. But look, I'm not holding my breath on that.
Treasurer, I wonder whether maybe you're paying the price for a previous licence plate sort of quote, you know, Victoria on the move, and people now want that in your train link to the airport.
True, but that was a Jeff Kennett number plate.
Have we got other questions?
Treasurer, Chris James from Northlink, and congratulations on your infrastructure agenda. I'll hark back to a time during the last Labor government when you were Ports Minister and you approved the deepening of the channels in Port Phillip Bay, and a very good decision it was too. It's actually underpinned the growth of larger ships coming into the bay and leaving the bay, increased container growth, and that'll increase exponentially out to 2030 and beyond. That's leading to a fair bit of congestion around the port area with trucks especially, and it's bringing up again the notion of rail shuttles in and out of the port, and there's strong, I suppose, strong arguments from the north, east and west for rail shuttles to come in and out, servicing those areas. And we know that there's Commonwealth state money on the table and an expression of interest process. Firstly, what's your view on that, and where is that process at?
Thanks, Chris. Well, there is absolutely no doubt that there are constrictions around our port area. And one of the reasons why Melbourne became the largest container port in the nation was how well the freight connections were into and from our port, and from our provincial areas as well. So we have to make a greater effort to address that. We now, of course, have a third container port operator operating out of Webb Dock, and that puts enormous pressure on our freeway network. And of course, coming into the port from the west or the north, the Westgate Bridge is probably the most likely route that will be employed, and once again, more pressure being put on the Westgate Bridge. So I think increasingly the Westgate Tunnel is a critical part of that story. It relieves pressure on the bridge, and it also accommodates the operators of Webb Dock as well as the operators at Swanston and Appleton Dock. The more challenging issue, but one that we've committed to addressing, is the principle of how do we deal with rail freight access to the port. Incorporated within the lease arrangements for the port is an obligation within 5 years of the transaction for rail freight connections to have been developed and underway for the purposes of ensuring that we can manage the problem and not see it exclusively as a road-based problem. And when you look at the Port of Melbourne, the rail connections that are in place at the moment, and also the land that is available for effective intermodal hubbing, I think that there is great opportunity to concentrate that activity, remove it from suburban areas, and also to get a much better and more efficient functioning port with modern freight routes, including rail freight.
Treasurer, while I'm waiting for another hand to shoot up, I'll take you back to Michael Blythe's presentation, and I think one of the positive stories that comes out from that presentation is just the potential that sits there in Asia for us. You spoke a bit about education. I'm just wondering how you see the future in terms of the opportunities that might be available to the state of Victoria from that tremendous growth, and what the implications of that are for planning and infrastructure as well.
It's a great question. There's no doubt that our biggest income earner for the state of Victoria at the moment is education services, just as services more generally are a great revenue earner for the state's economy, largely on the back of the level of educational attainment that Victorians have. So it comes back to the earlier point I made. We've got to continue to invest in education. It's what we sell, our skills and expertise, we sell that to the world. Sure, we sell some fantastic produce as well and plenty of other things, but selling our skills to the world, our educational attainment to the world is important. And of course the world is flocking, particularly Asia is flocking to our universities, which are world class for the purposes of education. How do we enhance that? Well, there are a couple of things we can do. Recognise that in China we have to pick our markets quite effectively, and it's quite obvious that as the medium wage in a number of countries in cities, I beg your pardon, in China reach a particular level, their appetite for the provision of educational services externally grows quite profoundly, just as their appetite for tourism grows. So we're monitoring those, we target them with the university sector for the purposes of letting them know that there is a quality product on offer in Victoria. Recognising that there are other markets outside of China that we should be working on, and our India strategy, which the Premier recently released, looks towards doubling our engagement in the education area with Indian students as well. Importantly, I think we have to recognise that our engagement with Asia just can't be a commercial one. And the point I'd make about that is I think we do need to recognise at a national level the tone of the language that we present at a national level to our Asian neighbours is critically important. If people don't feel welcome in this place, they won't do business with you. And I just urge restraint in some of the more bellicose language that goes with what is fundamentally a domestic debate, often about crime, that needs to be measured and managed so much better. Crime and, might I say, migration. We have to manage these things better in a much more mature sense. Otherwise, the exposure of the state, of the national economy, could well be compromised.
A question over here. Just while I'm waiting for the microphone to go over there. When we were in Tasmania, a really interesting observation that was made around the link with education was talking about tourism as well, and sort of saying that a lot of tourists to Tasmania go in, they'll stay for a day or two, but actually what's delivering a really big boom to the economy is parents coming to visit their kids who are studying at university in Tasmania, and the overflow into the tourism industry because they stay for weeks rather than days. So there's interesting flow-on effects there as well.
Well, I have a conflict of interest, of course, Melinda, about Tasmania. I saw from your documentation that I'm the Treasurer of Tasmania.
I was hoping you weren't going to draw attention to that. I was deciding whether or not I should just sort of alert the audience to the fact that he had a promotion. But my apologies.
They make great whiskey.
In all honesty, I have to say it's been a rather frenetic week with the rollout of the EPO, but I'm sure you understand that.
Thank you. Treasurer Robert Nicholson, Herbert Smith Freehills. I've got a question for you that's a bit outside your portfolio and will make your media people even more nervous. But you've been straying a bit into the education space because it is such an important industry for the state. But I wanted to ask you, are we teaching our children the right things? Are they developing the skills and the knowledge that will be necessary to drive the economy of the future?
That's a great question, Robert, and I think one of the really relevant debates we're having at the moment, and certainly employers have been saying loud and clear to government, is you need to better integrate your technical training with your education system. And I think in many ways how we address that is having an educated community where we can put kids the opportunity to attain the sort of education and employment subsequently that they want. So recognising that VCAL at the moment, about 5%, 10% of all kids who are going through a year 11 and year 12 do VCAL, and I've got a question why applied learning is seen as being a second-class education. And we have to do more in this space. And quite frankly, I see it as a failure of policy in a sense that it's seen as a second-class education because we're not integrating applied learning into applied work opportunities, and we're not appealing to employers in that respect. So we are doing a lot of work in that respect. Our TAFEs are now showing some very dramatic improvement. We're building some 12 technical schools right across Victoria, and those will hopefully be able to integrate a much greater focus around the provision of technical skills and expertise. But I think the real challenge for us as a community is to recognise that the greatest commitment we can make to the future is to education and to skilling up the workforce, and not to find ourselves constrained by the old adage that it's been done this way historically and that's the way it should be done forevermore. And in education, particularly in the skills area, we do need to challenge ourselves a bit. We need to do better, and we need to work much closer with employers who are willing to participate in not only providing work opportunities post-school, but to be part of the educational process as well.
Got time for one last question? Sorry, over here.
Hi, Treasurer. Nick Varagos from OPIUS. Just bringing you back to the airport, whilst you were talking about that train or tram line to go via Sunshine, I did a quick calculation. That's about 6.5 kilometres from Essendon to Tullamarine. And as I understand it, there's a tram already that goes to Essendon. Why can't we just connect a short-termer, at least to get people back and forth? A lot of people who commute just on work, they don't need to have a fast train or whatever, just get on the tram.
Well, that's a fantastic idea. That'll save me a heck of a lot of money, but I don't think I'm going to get too many people as enthusiastic as you about the idea of a fast tram line to the airport. If you accept my basic proposition that I've had to fly the white flag on this because this goes to people's regard of the city and its functionality, its presentation to the world, I think whilst there may be arguments as to the efficiency of such a method, so please don't see my mirth as dismissing the idea as a bad idea. The reality is that people are going to require a very substantial investment by the state and hopefully the federal government and hopefully, might I say, the private sector in delivering an efficient high capacity rail link to the airport, and that's what we're committed to.
Thank you, Treasurer. Well, that ends the Q&A, unfortunately, Treasurer. Can I thank you very much for that? Can we also thank Michael Blythe for his presentation? So would you join me in thanking them?